The wounded dragon Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he checked the corn crops one last time before sunset. The golden fields stretched endlessly under the orange sky of New Terra, a planet humans had settled 50 years ago. His farm was small compared to the massive corporate plantations, but it was his home, his life's work. The sound came first, a low whimper that made him freeze. It wasn't human, wasn't any earth animal he knew. Living on the frontier meant being careful. New Terra had its dangers, and not all of them were natural. Following the sound, Marcus walked toward the edge of his property where the forest began. There, caught in the metal fencing that marked his boundary, was something he had never seen before. It looked like a dragon from the old Earth stories, but smaller, about the size of a large dog. Its scales shimmered with colors that changed from blue to purple to silver in the fading light. One wing was badly torn, tangled in the wire fence, and dark blood stained its beautiful scales. The creature looked at him with large, intelligent eyes that held both fear and pain. It tried to pull away when it saw him, but the movement only made the wire cut deeper into its wing. Marcus had heard rumors. The galactic community had many species, and some of them were not friendly to humans. Earth was still considered a young, aggressive planet by most alien standards. Humans were often seen as dangerous, unpredictable. But looking at this wounded creature, Marcus saw only suffering. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, crouching down slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon-like creature made a sound that was almost like a purr mixed with a growl. Its eyes never left Marcus as he examined the fence. The wire had twisted around the wing in several places. Getting it free would take time and patience. Marcus went back to his house and returned with wire cutters, a first aid kit, and a blanket. The creature watched him approach again, its breathing rapid and shallow. It was clearly exhausted and losing blood. "Okay, I know you're scared," Marcus said, sitting down near the fence but not too close. "But if I don't help you, you're going to die here. And I can't let that happen, even if you are trespassing on my property." The dragon tilted its head as if it understood his words. Marcus had heard that many alien species could understand human languages, even if they couldn't speak them. Working slowly and carefully, Marcus began cutting the wire. Each time the dragon flinched or made a sound of pain, he stopped and waited. It took almost an hour to free the wing, and by then both Marcus and the dragon were exhausted. The wing was badly damaged, with several deep cuts and what looked like a broken bone. Marcus had treated injured animals before, but nothing like this. Still, basic wound care was the same for most living things. "I'm going to clean these cuts now," he told the dragon. "It's going to hurt, but it has to be done." To his surprise, the dragon held perfectly still while Marcus cleaned and bandaged its wounds. It made small sounds of pain, but it didn't try to bite or scratch him. Its trust was both touching and puzzling. When Marcus finished, the dragon tried to fly, but its injured wing couldn't support its weight. It landed awkwardly and looked up at Marcus with what seemed like confusion and fear. "You can't fly right now," Marcus explained. "That wing needs time to heal, and you're too weak from blood loss anyway." The dragon made a series of soft clicking sounds that almost sounded like language. Its eyes were still focused on Marcus, but the fear was fading, replaced by something that looked like curiosity. Marcus made a decision that he knew might be dangerous. "Look, you can stay here until you heal, but you have to promise not to damage my crops or hurt my livestock. This farm is how I make my living, and I can't afford to lose it." The dragon's head bobbed up and down in what looked remarkably like a nod. Then it did something unexpected. It lowered its head until its forehead touched the ground near Marcus's feet, holding the position for several seconds before raising its head again. "I'll take that as a yes," Marcus said with a smile. He helped the dragon to his barn, where he set up a comfortable area with old blankets and a water dish. The creature settled down with a contented sigh, its eyes already growing heavy with exhaustion. As Marcus walked back to his house, he couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. The galactic government had strict rules about contact between humans and other species. Harboring an alien creature, even an injured one, could get him in serious trouble. But as he looked back at the barn, he felt no regret. The dragon had been dying, and he had saved it. That was what mattered. Humans might be seen as aggressive by the rest of the galaxy, but Marcus knew something about his species that others often missed. When humans saw suffering, they helped. It was as simple and complicated as that. He would figure out the rest tomorrow. Tonight, both he and the dragon needed rest. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of soft humming coming from the barn. He dressed quickly and went to check on his unexpected guest. The dragon was awake, examining its bandaged wing with careful attention. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked. The dragon looked up and made those same clicking sounds as before, but this time Marcus noticed a pattern to them. It almost sounded like the creature was trying to communicate in a structured way. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Marcus would check the dragon's wounds each morning and evening, changing the bandages and applying medicine. In return, the dragon seemed to understand that the farm was Marcus's territory and stayed away from the crops and animals. But Marcus began to notice other things. The dragon was clearly intelligent, watching everything Marcus did with intense interest. It learned quickly where it was and wasn't allowed to go, and sometimes Marcus caught it looking at the sky with an expression that could only be described as longing. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, Marcus realized he was dealing with more than just an injured animal. He was caring for a being that might be every bit as intelligent as he was, and that changed everything. Understanding each other. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first found the dragon, and their daily routine had become comfortable for both of them. The creature's wing was healing well, though it would be some time before it could fly again. Marcus had started calling it azure because of the way its scales shifted to brilliant blue when it was content. This morning was different. As Marcus approached the barn with fresh water and food, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Azure was making sounds, but they weren't the usual clicks and purrs. They were words, broken, heavily accented, but definitely words in human language. "Marcus," the dragon was saying slowly, practicing the sounds. "Marcus." Marcus entered the barn quietly, not wanting to startle his guest. Azure looked up and saw him, then straightened proudly. "Marcus," Azure said more clearly this time. The voice was neither male nor female, but musical in a way that reminded Marcus of wind chimes. "You can talk," Marcus said, amazed. "You've been learning to speak human." "Learning, yes," Azure replied carefully. "Your language is difficult, but I understand much. Watch you, listen you, learn from you." Marcus sat down on an old crate, his mind racing. If Azure could talk, that meant they could really communicate. It also meant the situation was even more complicated than he had thought. "Where are you from?" Marcus asked gently. Azure's scales shifted to deeper purple, which Marcus had learned meant the dragon was thinking hard or feeling uncertain. "Far," Azure said finally. "Very far. My people, we fly between stars. I am young, was exploring. Got lost, injured, crashed here. Your people are looking for you?" Azure's scales turned almost black. "No, I was, how you say, forbidden to go so far. I disobeyed. They think I am dead. Probably glad I am gone." The sadness in Azure's voice made Marcus's chest tighten. "Why would they be glad?" "I am different," Azure explained, struggling with the words. "Other dragons, they only care about flying, hunting, being strong. I care about other things. I like to learn, to understand different beings. They say this makes me weak, useless." Marcus felt a familiar anger rise in him. Every species seemed to have individuals who didn't fit the mold, and too often those individuals were rejected by their own kind. "You're not useless," Marcus said firmly. "Being curious about other beings, wanting to learn, that's not weakness. That's wisdom." Azure's scales brightened to a warm gold. "You really think this?" "I know it," Marcus replied. "Some of the greatest humans in history were the ones who wanted to understand others, to learn about different ways of thinking and living." Over the following days, their conversations grew longer and more complex as Azure's language skills improved rapidly. The dragon had an incredible ability to learn, picking up not just words but concepts with startling speed. Azure told Marcus about dragon society, how they lived in vast flocks that moved between star systems, how status was determined by flight speed and hunting prowess, how young dragons were expected to prove themselves through acts of aggression and dominance. "They would not understand you," Azure said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "Humans are supposed to be violent, dangerous. But you saved me, cared for me, asked nothing in return. This does not match what my people believe about humans." "What do they believe?" Marcus asked. "That humans are destroyers, that you take what you want and kill what you cannot use, that you spread across galaxy like disease, making everything ugly and dead." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He couldn't deny that some humans had done terrible things. both on Earth and on the worlds they had colonized. But he also knew that wasn't the whole story. Some humans are like that, he admitted. But not all. Many of us just want to live peacefully, to build something good, to help when we can. Yes, Azure agreed. I see this in you. You are different from what I was taught about humans, just like I am different from what is expected of dragons. As Azure's wing healed, the dragon began helping around the farm. At first, Marcus was worried about the promise he had extracted that first night, about not damaging his crops. But Azure was incredibly careful, using precise movements to help with tasks that required delicate work. The dragon's help proved invaluable during harvest time. Azure could reach places Marcus couldn't, could spot problems with crops from above when it practiced short flights, and had an intuitive understanding of plant health that amazed Marcus. How do you know so much about farming? Marcus asked one day as Azure carefully harvested tomatoes with small, precise claws. We dragons, we understand growing things, Azure explained. On our world, before we learned to fly between stars, we tended great gardens in the sky. Floating islands with perfect soil. Most dragons have forgotten this knowledge, think it is beneath them now. But I remember the old stories, the old ways. Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Here was a being from another world, another species entirely, who not only understood agriculture but approached it with an almost reverent care that put many human farmers to shame. But their peaceful routine was interrupted one morning when Marcus noticed ships in the sky, not human ships, but sleek vessels that moved with an organic grace unlike any human technology. Azure saw them too and immediately hid in the barn, scales turning pale with fear. They found me, Azure whispered. My people, they have found me. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge. Will they hurt you? Worse, Azure replied, trembling. They will take me back, force me to conform. I will never see the stars again except through their eyes. Never learn anything new, never be myself. The ships landed in Marcus's field, and figures emerged. Dragons like Azure but larger, their scales dark and intimidating. Their leader, a massive dragon with scales like polished obsidian, approached the farmhouse with deliberate, threatening movements. Marcus stepped outside to meet them, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. He had made a promise to protect Azure and he intended to keep it, no matter what the cost. The confrontation. The lead dragon towered over Marcus, its dark scales reflecting the morning sun like black mirrors. When it spoke, its voice was deep and commanding, each word carefully chosen in perfect human language. Human farmer, you harbor one of our young. Return Azurix to us immediately, and we will overlook this illegal contact between our species. Marcus stood his ground, though his heart was racing. Azure is injured and recovering. I found them hurt and dying on my property. Azurix, the dragon corrected sharply. That is the proper name. And their injuries are no concern of yours. Our young must learn to survive or perish. It is our way. Behind the leader, 4 other dragons arranged themselves in a threatening formation. They were all larger than Azure, their movements precise and military. Marcus could feel their disapproval rolling off them in waves. What if I refuse? Marcus asked quietly. The leader's eyes narrowed to golden slits. Humans are known for their foolish bravery and interference in matters that do not concern them. But you should understand that we could simply take what is ours. Your primitive weapons cannot harm us. Maybe not, Marcus agreed, but I made a promise to protect Azure while they heal. I don't break my promises. From inside the barn, Marcus could hear a soft sound. Azure was listening to every word. The dragon had been terrified when the ships appeared, but now Marcus wondered if there was something else in that fear. Disappointment, maybe, that their own people had come not to rescue but to reclaim. You speak of protection, the leader said with something that might have been amusement. But what do you truly know of Azarix? They are weak, defective. They show interest in inferior species like yourself, instead of focusing on dragon superiority. They waste time on foolish pursuits instead of mastering the skills that matter. Marcus felt anger building in his chest. Azure is one of the smartest, kindest beings I've ever met. If that's what you call defective, then your definition of strength is wrong. The leader's head drew back slightly, surprised by Marcus's boldness. You dare question dragon judgment? I dare question anyone who thinks curiosity and compassion are weaknesses, Marcus shot back. Azure has taught me things about farming I never knew. They've shown respect for my property and my animals. They've worked harder than most humans I know, despite being injured and far from home. Impossible. One of the other dragons spoke for the first time. Azarix is barely past the first molting. They know nothing of value. Then you haven't been paying attention, Marcus said. He was committed now, might as well go all the way. Azure understands growing things in ways that could revolutionize agriculture. They have knowledge of plant cultivation that your people have forgotten. The dragons exchanged glances, and Marcus saw something flicker in their expressions. Uncertainty, perhaps even interest. The old earth-tending ways are dead knowledge, the leader said, but with less conviction than before. We are a spacefaring people now. We have no need for such primitive skills. Then why are you having trouble feeding your population? Marcus asked, taking a guess based on something Azure had mentioned. Why are your colony worlds struggling with crop failures? The silence that followed told Marcus his guess had been correct. He pressed his advantage. Azure told me about the floating gardens your people used to tend. That knowledge isn't primitive, it's advanced beyond anything humans have developed. But you've abandoned it for what? Flying fast and looking impressive? Silence, the leader roared, but Marcus caught the defensive tone beneath the anger. At that moment, Azure emerged from the barn. The young dragon moved slowly, deliberately, placing themselves between Marcus and the adult dragons. Their scales were a steady, calm blue-green that Marcus had learned meant determination. Elder Korath, Azure said formally, addressing the leader. I greet you according to the old ways. Azure performed a complex ritual bow that involved specific wing positions and tail movements. The adult dragons looked startled by this display of traditional respect. Azarix, Korath replied after a moment. You have learned the formal greetings. This is unexpected. I have learned many things during my time here, Azure said. Not just the human language, but their ways of thinking. Their approaches to problems we dragons face. Consorting with lesser species is forbidden, another dragon interjected. Then perhaps our definitions of lesser need examination, Azure replied calmly. This human, Marcus, saved my life when I was dying. He asked nothing in return except that I not damage his crops. He shared his food, his shelter, his knowledge. When I expressed interest in his farming methods, he taught me gladly. Azure turned to gesture toward Marcus's fields. Look at his crops, Elder Korath. See how healthy they are. How efficiently his small plot produces food. He feeds not only himself, but contributes to feeding his entire settlement. Is this not worthy of respect? Korath followed Azure's gaze, and Marcus could see the dragon examining his farm with new eyes. The other dragons were looking too, their expressions less dismissive than before. Moreover, Azure continued, Marcus has shown me that strength comes in many forms. Physical power is one kind, yes, but the strength to help an enemy, the strength to keep promises even when threatened, the strength to stand up for what is right despite danger, these are not lesser forms of strength. They may be greater. You speak like a philosopher, not a dragon, Korath said, but the words lacked the earlier harshness. Perhaps dragons need more philosophers, Azure replied. Perhaps that is why our colonies fail while human settlements thrive. The dragons were clearly uncomfortable with this line of reasoning, but Marcus could see that Azure's words were having an effect. These beings might value strength above all else, but they were intelligent enough to recognize truth when they heard it. What do you propose, Azarix? Korath asked finally. Test me, Azure said simply. Give me the trials you would give any young dragon, but judge them fairly. Do not dismiss my accomplishments simply because they were learned from a human. Marcus held his breath. This wasn't what he had expected, but he understood what Azure was doing. The young dragon was fighting for acceptance on their own terms, using their people's own values against them. Very well, Korath said after a long pause. You will be tested. But know that if you fail, you will be exiled permanently, and this human will face judgment for his interference in dragon affairs. Azure's scales shifted to a determined gold. I understand, and I accept. As the dragons arranged themselves to begin whatever trials they had in mind, Marcus realized that his quiet life as a farmer was about to become much more complicated. But looking at Azure's brave stance, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice he had made that first night. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. The trials begin. The dragons cleared a large area in Marcus's field for the trials, their movements efficient and practiced. Marcus watched from his porch, feeling helpless as Azure faced what might be an impossible test. The young dragon had grown stronger over the weeks of recovery, but was still much smaller than the adults. The first trial is speed, Elder Korath announced. You will race Vanix in straight flight across the valley and back. Vanix was the largest of the dragons after Korath, with silver-gray scales and wings that seemed to cut through the air like knives. Azure looked tiny in comparison, their blue-green scales pale with nervousness. My wing is still healing, Azure said quietly, but I will try. Marcus wanted to protest, but he knew intervention would only make things worse. This was Azure's fight now. The two dragons positioned themselves at the starting line Korath had marked in the dirt. At the Elder's signal, they launched into the sky. Vanix shot forward like an arrow, his powerful wings driving him ahead with incredible speed. Azure followed, struggling to keep up, their injured wing clearly causing pain with each beat. Marcus watched in agony as Azure fell further and further behind. By the time they reached the far end of the valley, Vanix was already turning for the return flight. But as Marcus watched, something changed in Azure's flying pattern. Instead of trying to match Vanix's brute force approach, Azure began using the air currents, riding the thermals and wind patterns with subtle adjustments that conserved energy. On the return flight, Azure began closing the gap, not through speed but through efficiency. While Vanix fought against every air current, Azure worked with them, making the wind itself an ally. By the time they reached the finish line, Azure was only seconds behind. Vanix landed hard, breathing heavily and clearly exhausted. Azure touched down lightly, their breathing elevated but controlled. Interesting technique, Korath observed. But you still lost. Yes, Azure agreed. But observe the energy expenditure. Vanix will need significant rest before flying again. I could repeat this flight several times. In a real situation, carrying supplies to a distant colony or conducting extended reconnaissance, which approach serves the flock better? The dragons exchanged glances. Marcus could see that Azure had made a point they hadn't expected. The second trial is combat, Korath announced. You will face Threx in aerial battle until one yields. Threx was a red-scaled dragon with scars across her muzzle and a predatory gleam in her eyes. Azure's scales flickered with fear before settling into resigned determination. I understand, Azure said, though I should mention that I have learned some things about fighting from my time with Marcus. Marcus blinked in surprise. He hadn't taught Azure anything about fighting. The young dragon caught his eye and gave what might have been a wink. The two dragons took to the air, circling each other warily. Threx struck first, diving with claws extended. Azure dodged, but just barely, and Threx's claws left scratches across their tail. For several minutes, the fight looked hopelessly one-sided. Threx was faster, stronger, and far more experienced. Azure was being driven steadily downward, accumulating small wounds and clearly tiring. Then something unexpected happened. As Threx dove for what looked like a finishing attack, Azure suddenly twisted in midair and released their breath weapon. Not the flames Marcus would have expected, but a cloud of fine, sparkly dust that caught the morning sun. Threx flew straight into the cloud and emerged coughing and disoriented, their eyes streaming with tears. Azure used the moment to strike, not with claws or flames, but with a precise application of pressure to nerve points along Threx's wing joints, a technique that caused temporary paralysis without permanent harm. Threx crashed into the soft dirt of the field, unharmed but unable to fly. After a few moments, the paralysis wore off and she stood up, shaking her head in amazement. What was that? Korath demanded. The dust is pollen from Marcus's sunflower fields, Azure explained. I learned that it causes temporary blindness and breathing difficulty in dragons. The pressure technique is something I developed by studying human acupuncture texts in Marcus's library. Non-lethal but effective. You used farming knowledge as a weapon? Threx asked, sounding almost admiring. I used problem-solving skills, Azure corrected. Dragons always assume combat means claws and flames. But there are other ways to win a fight. Sometimes the best victory is the one that doesn't permanently harm your opponent. Marcus felt a surge of pride. Azure had taken human knowledge, medical techniques, and agricultural experience and adapted them into something entirely new. This was innovation at its finest. The final trial is wisdom, Korath announced after a long pause. You will be given a scenario that requires judgment. A human colony ship has crash-landed on one of our worlds. They are injured and starving. They request permission to settle on a small, seemingly worthless section of our territory. How do you respond?" The other dragons watched intently. Marcus realized this wasn't just a hypothetical. This was probably a real situation the dragon leadership was facing. Azure thought carefully before responding. "First, I would want to understand why they call the land worthless. In my experience, humans rarely settle somewhere without reason. They may see potential that we have missed. Assume the land truly has no value to us," Korath pressed. "Then I would grant their request, but with conditions," Azure continued. "I would ask them to share their knowledge of the land they came from, their techniques for cultivation and construction. I would propose a trial period where we could observe whether their presence benefits or harms the ecosystem. And if other dragons protested giving aid to a lesser species," Azure's scales shifted to the deep blue that Marcus had learned, meant they were about to say something important. "I would remind them that today, we are the strong ones in a position to help. Tomorrow we might be the ones in need of aid. The relationships we build when we are powerful determine how we are treated when we are weak. Moreover, diversity makes ecosystems stronger. A world with both dragons and humans might thrive in ways that neither could achieve alone." The silence that followed stretched for long minutes. Marcus watched the adult dragons' faces, trying to read their expressions. Finally, Korath spoke. "Your answers are unconventional, but not without merit." The elder dragon turned to Marcus. "Human farmer, you have harbored one of our young for nearly a month. What have you observed about Azarix?" Marcus stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "Azure is curious, hardworking, and incredibly intelligent. They've taught me things about farming I never knew, and they've learned human techniques faster than any student I've ever seen. They keep their promises, they respect boundaries, and they think about problems in ways that lead to better solutions. And do you believe they are ready to rejoin Dragon Society?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus realized that his answer might determine Azure's fate. "I think Azure is ready for whatever path they choose," Marcus said finally. "But I also think Dragon Society would benefit from having them as a member who can bridge the gap between species. The galaxy is getting smaller every year. We're going to have to learn to work together eventually." Korath nodded slowly, then turned back to Azure. "Azarix, you have passed the trials, though not in the manner we expected. The question now is whether you wish to return with us." Azure looked from their people to Marcus, their scales cycling through a rainbow of colors as they wrestled with the decision. Marcus held his breath, waiting to learn what choice his friend would make. A new path forward. Azure stood silently for a long moment, their scales shifting through subtle shades of blue and green as they considered their options. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out in those color changes, the longing to be accepted by their own kind, warring with the knowledge that acceptance might come at the cost of everything they had learned to value. "Elder Korath," Azure finally said, "I am grateful that you consider me worthy to return, but I have a different proposal to make." The adult dragons tensed, clearly not expecting this response. Korath's golden eyes narrowed slightly. "Speak," the elder commanded. Azure took a deep breath and straightened to their full height, small as it was compared to the others. "Our people face challenges. Colony worlds struggle with food production. Our traditional methods of expansion, taking what we need by force, have made us enemies across the galaxy. Meanwhile, humans continue to spread and thrive despite being younger and physically weaker than us." "What is your point, Azarix?" Threx interrupted impatiently. "My point is that we could learn from them," Azure continued. "Not just humans, but many species. We could build partnerships instead of demanding submission. We could share knowledge instead of hoarding it," Vanek scoffed. "Dragons do not need to learn from lesser beings." "Then why are our colonies failing while theirs succeed?" Azure shot back. "Marcus has a small farm on a planet we considered worthless. Yet he feeds 50 families with his surplus crops. Our agricultural specialist cannot match his yields on worlds we consider prime territory." Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment at being used as an example, but he could see that Azure was building toward something important. "I propose an experiment," Azure continued. "Let me remain here as an ambassador, not just to humans, but as a bridge between our species and theirs. Let me establish a research station where dragons and humans can work together to solve problems that affect us both." The suggestion clearly caught the adult dragons off guard. They huddled together, speaking in rapid dragon tongue too fast and complex for Marcus to follow. Azure waited patiently, their scales now a steady, confident gold. When the conference ended, Korath faced Azure again. Such an arrangement would be unprecedented. It would require approval from the High Council. You would be alone among aliens, far from any dragon support. I would not be alone, Azure replied, glancing at Marcus. I would have friends here. And if the experiment succeeds, I would not remain alone for long. Other dragons would come to learn and contribute. Elder Korath turned to Marcus unexpectedly. Human farmer, would you support such an arrangement? Would your people accept a permanent dragon presence on your world? Marcus felt the weight of the moment. His answer could change the relationship between two species, maybe even influence the future of the galaxy. But as he looked at Azure, brave, intelligent Azure who had risked everything to stand up for what they believed, the choice was easy. Azure would be welcome here for as long as they choose to stay, Marcus said firmly. As for my people accepting dragons, that would depend on the dragons. But if they're anything like Azure, I think we'd get along fine. You speak only for yourself, Vanix pointed out. What of your government? Your military? Our government will listen if the proposal makes sense, Marcus replied. Humans are practical. We judge beings by their actions, not their species. Azure has proven themselves to be trustworthy, intelligent, and helpful. That's what matters. Korath was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing options that went far beyond this single decision. Finally, he spoke. The High Council will need to review this proposal. Until then, Azarix, you may remain here provisionally. But understand, if this experiment fails, if there are any incidents that reflect poorly on dragon honor, the consequences will be severe. I understand, Azure replied, and I accept the responsibility. Furthermore, Korath continued, you will report regularly on human capabilities, culture, and technology. This information will help the Council make informed decisions about future relationships between our species. Marcus felt a moment of unease at the intelligence-gathering aspect, but Azure's response reassured him. I will report honestly about everything I observe and learn. Azure agreed. Both the strengths and weaknesses of human society, and the potential benefits and risks of closer cooperation between our peoples. The formal arrangements took several more hours to establish. The dragons would return to their fleet and present the proposal to the High Council. Azure would remain on New Terra with a provisional diplomatic status, not quite an ambassador but more than a refugee. Marcus would serve as their initial human contact and sponsor. As the sun began to set, the adult dragons prepared to leave. Korath approached Azure for a final private conversation, speaking in dragon tongue. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he could see the emotion in both their postures. A mixture of concern, hope, and what looked like genuine affection. When the conversation ended, Korath addressed Marcus directly. Farmer Marcus, you have shown honor in your treatment of our young one. Whether this experiment succeeds or fails, that will not be forgotten. Azure saved themselves, Marcus replied. I just provided a safe place for them to heal and grow. Perhaps, Korath said. But choosing to provide that safety required courage. Your species may be more worthy of respect than we have acknowledged. The dragons departed as they had arrived, their ships rising silently into the evening sky. Marcus and Azure stood together in the field, watching until the vessels disappeared among the stars. Are you sure about this? Marcus asked quietly. You're giving up a lot. Your family, your culture, everything familiar. Azure's scale shifted to a warm, contented blue. I am not giving up my culture. I am expanding it. And as for family, they turned to look at Marcus with those large, intelligent eyes. I think family is something you choose, not something you are born with. Marcus felt a warmth in his chest at those words. Over the past months, he had come to think of Azure as more than just a guest or even a friend. The young dragon had become something like family to him too. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now we build something new, Azure replied. A place where different species can work together, learn from each other, and prove that cooperation is stronger than domination. As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, Marcus couldn't help but smile. A few months ago, his biggest concern had been crop yields and weather patterns. Now he was apparently part of an interspecies diplomatic experiment that could reshape galactic politics. But looking at Azure, brilliant, determined Azure who had turned a chance encounter into an opportunity to build bridges between worlds, Marcus realized he wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes the most important journeys began with a simple act of kindness. Building bridges 6 months later, Marcus's farm had transformed into something he never could have imagined. What had once been a simple agricultural operation now buzzed with activity from multiple species. Azure's provisional diplomatic status had attracted attention from across the sector, and their research station had grown from a single converted barn into a complex of buildings housing scientists, diplomats, and curious visitors from dozens of worlds. The success had come gradually, built on small victories and careful trust building. The first breakthrough had been Azure's development of hybrid farming techniques that combined human crop rotation methods with ancient dragon soil cultivation practices. The results had been dramatic, yield increases of over 40% with significantly less environmental impact. Word of these successes had spread through human colonial networks and, apparently, through dragon communication channels as well. Within months, agricultural specialists from both species were requesting permission to study the techniques. Azure had insisted that all knowledge be shared freely, refusing any attempts to patent or restrict access to their innovations. Knowledge grows when it is shared, Azure had explained to a frustrated human corporate representative. Hoarding information benefits no one except those who profit from scarcity. The dragon's philosophy had attracted attention from species beyond humans and dragons. Crystalline beings from the Andromeda sector had sent observers to study Azure's collaborative methods. A delegation of aquatic specialists from the water worlds had established a temporary research station to explore underwater agriculture applications. Even the notoriously isolated machine intelligences had sent a representative to analyze the efficiency improvements. Marcus often found himself in the surreal position of hosting interstellar dinner parties where humans passed bread to beings of living crystal, while Azure translated jokes between species that communicated in entirely different ways. But it was the small, daily interactions that meant the most to him, like this morning when he found Azure in the greenhouse, carefully tending a batch of experimental seedlings with Dr. Sarah Chen, the human botanist who had become the station's co-director. The root structure is responding beautifully to the mineral supplements, Dr. Chen was saying as Marcus approached. I've never seen growth rates like this in terrestrial plants. The dragon cultivation songs help as well, Azure added, their scales shifting to the pleased gold color Marcus had learned to associate with scientific breakthrough. Plants respond to specific sound frequencies. What my people once called magic was actually sophisticated acoustic agriculture. Speaking of your people, Marcus said, joining the conversation, I saw ships landing this morning. More visitors? Azure's scales brightened further. Elder Korath has returned with news from the High Council. And he is not alone. 3 other elders have come to evaluate the station personally. Marcus felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. In the months since Azure had been granted provisional status, several dragon officials had visited. Most had been grudgingly impressed, but there was always the possibility that the High Council would decide the experiment had gone too far. How are you feeling about it? Dr. Chen asked, clearly sensing Azure's mixture of excitement and anxiety. Hopeful, Azure replied honestly. The results speak for themselves. Food production improvements, successful collaboration between species, technological innovations that benefit everyone involved. But I know that change comes slowly to dragon leadership. That afternoon, Marcus found himself once again hosting a formal meeting in his converted barn, now equipped with translation systems and seating for multiple species types. Elder Korath looked much the same as he had 6 months ago, but the 3 dragons who accompanied him were studying everything with obvious curiosity, rather than the suspicion Marcus had expected. Azurix, Korath began formally, you will present your findings to the council. What followed was the most comprehensive presentation Marcus had ever witnessed. Azure had prepared meticulously, documenting every aspect of the interspecies collaboration. They showed yield improvements, technological innovations, and successful conflict resolutions. They presented testimonies from visiting scientists, economic analyses of the station's impact, and projections for future expansion. But what impressed Marcus most was how Azure addressed the cultural concerns that he knew worried the dragon leadership. Some have suggested that working closely with other species weakens dragon identity, Azure said near the end of their presentation. I believe the opposite is true. By sharing our knowledge and learning from others, we discover what makes us uniquely valuable. Dragon cultivation techniques have proven superior to human methods in several key areas. Our flight capabilities offer perspectives that ground-based species cannot achieve. Our long lifespans allow for research projects that shorter-lived beings cannot complete. But, prompted Elder Korath, sensing there was more. But we also learned that human innovation cycles complement our methodical approaches. Their rapid generation turnover means faster adaptation to new challenges. Their tendency to question authority has led to breakthrough discoveries that our more hierarchical thinking might have missed. Azure gestured toward the room full of diverse beings. Together we accomplish more than any single species could alone. This is not weakness, it is the ultimate expression of strength. The dragons conferred in their own language for what felt like hours. Marcus watched their body language, trying to read the subtle shifts in posture and wing position that Azure had taught him, indicated different emotional states. Finally, Korath spoke. The High Council has reached a decision. This experiment will be expanded. 3 additional research stations will be established on different worlds, with senior dragons assigned to lead them in cooperation with local species. Azure's scales exploded into brilliant rainbow colors, pure joy mixed with triumph and relief. Furthermore, Korath continued, Azurix will be granted full diplomatic status and appointed as Director of Interspecies Agricultural Research. They will report jointly to the Dragon High Council and the Galactic Trade Consortium. The room erupted in celebration as representatives from various species congratulated Azure on their appointment. Marcus felt a surge of pride for his friend, but also a moment of sadness. Azure had achieved everything they had dreamed of: acceptance from their people and the chance to build bridges between species. They would probably be leaving soon, moving on to bigger and more important work. As the celebration wound down and the various delegates departed for their accommodations, Marcus found himself alone with Azure in the quiet of his original farmhouse kitchen. So, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice light, I suppose you'll be leaving us soon. Director of Interspecies Agricultural Research sounds like a position that requires traveling to all those new stations. Azure's scales shifted to a gentle blue-green. The color Marcus had learned indicated deep thoughtfulness. Actually, Azure said slowly, I have been thinking about that. The position requires oversight of multiple locations, yes, but it also requires a permanent base of operations, a place where all the research can be coordinated and where new visitors can be trained in collaborative techniques. Azure looked around the familiar kitchen, then back at Marcus. I cannot think of a better headquarters than the place where it all began. If, of course, the original farmer would be willing to continue hosting an increasingly busy research station. Marcus felt his heart lift. I think the original farmer could probably manage that, especially since he's gotten pretty good at cooking for multiple species. Azure's scales brightened to warm gold. Then it is settled. We stay here and continue building bridges, one friendship at a time. As Marcus looked out the window at the diverse collection of buildings that had grown up around his original farm, he marveled at how a single act of kindness had led to something so much larger than he could have imagined. Dragons and humans working together in his fields, crystalline beings studying plant genetics in converted barns, aquatic specialists developing underwater cultivation techniques in specially constructed pools. It had all started with a simple promise. Come here, little alien dragon. Let me help you, but you must promise not to trespass on my farm. Now, beings from across the galaxy were learning that trespassing wasn't necessary when you were invited to belong. And that, Marcus reflected, made all the difference. The galaxy was indeed getting smaller every year, but instead of leading to conflict, it was leading to connection. One friendship, one collaboration, one shared meal at a time. The barriers between species were dissolving into something better, a community where differences were valued and cooperation was strength. As Azure settled down beside him to plan the next day's research schedule, Marcus smiled. He had set out to be a simple farmer, and in the end he supposed that's exactly what he had become. He just happened to be farming something more valuable than crops. He was cultivating understanding between worlds.